There's an emotion so seemingly insignificant, so tiny, that most people completely overlook it, dismissing it as nothing at all. But this emotion, this undercurrent, is silently sabotaging your spiritual awakening, subtly feeding your ego, and keeping you trapped in a state of everyday unawareness. That emotion is annoyance, that persistent feeling of frustration. Eckhart Tolle has spoken extensively, profoundly, about why an irritated ego is far more insidious, far more dangerous, than outright explosive anger. When you become openly angry, at least you know something is fundamentally wrong. The sheer intensity of anger forces you to take notice, to acknowledge its presence. But irritation, well, irritation is subtle. It creeps in, undetected, like a slow leak. It operates beneath the surface, all while you believe you are perfectly calm, in control. And that right there, is precisely what makes it so dangerous. When you become upset, discontented, irritated, or even slightly depressed, it's a clear sign, a signal, that you've lost touch with the present moment. You've lost access to that vertical dimension of consciousness, that deeper awareness. You've lost awareness of yourself, as awareness itself. In that precise moment, the ego has quietly taken over, and you likely don't even realize it. The ego absolutely loves irritation, Tolle explains. That, to the ego, a negative feeling. Any negative feeling is actually a good thing. The ego strengthens, it validates itself through negativity. Every single moment of irritation, no matter how small, is a feeding session for the ego. Every minor complaint, every subtle annoyance, every almost imperceptible frustration becomes fuel, energy. That makes the ego stronger, more resilient. This is why irritation is more dangerous than outright anger. Anger, true anger, burns out quickly. It's intense, yes, but usually relatively short-lived. After an angry outburst, you often feel depleted, exhausted, perhaps even deeply ashamed. The very intensity of the experience can become a catalyst, a trigger, for deeper self-awareness. But irritation can last for hours, days, even years. It becomes a background hum of negativity, a constant drone that you eventually stop noticing altogether. It becomes your normal state of being, the water you swim in, and all the while, the ego is feeding, growing, steadily strengthening its grip on your consciousness, on your very being. Consider, just for a moment, how many times each day you experience some form of irritation. The traffic is too slow, a classic example. The line at the coffee shop is too long. Another daily frustration, someone is talking too loudly nearby. The weather outside isn't right. It's never quite right, is it? Your coffee isn't hot enough. These seem like tiny, almost insignificant inconveniences, barely worth mentioning, but each tiny irritation, is the ego asserting itself, staking its claim. Each one is a small, almost imperceptible statement that says, that demands, that reality should be different from what it is. Each one pulls you out of the present moment and throws you headfirst into resistance, into conflict. Tolle calls this ordinary unconsciousness. It's that low-level, almost constant state of unease that most people live in, most of the time. It's not dramatic enough, not loud enough, to force you to address it head-on, but it's constant enough to keep you perpetually disconnected from presence. From that deeper awareness, the unease of ordinary unconsciousness can, and often does, turn into deep unconsciousness, a state of far more acute suffering, particularly when the ego feels threatened, or when you face a major life challenge, when this underlying resistance becomes intensified through some perceived challenge or threat to the ego's carefully constructed identity. It brings up intense negativity, such as seething anger, paralyzing fear, open aggression, and even deep depression. But it always starts with those seemingly harmless, small irritations. They are the gateway, the entry point, to those deeper, more destructive forms of unconsciousness. Think of it like a fire, a slow-burning fire. Irritation is the kindling. If you don't remove the kindling, if you keep adding those small sticks of annoyance, those twigs of complaint, eventually, you'll inevitably create the conditions for a much larger fire. Rage doesn't just appear out of thin air. It builds, slowly, insidiously, from countless small irritations that were never seen, never addressed, never dissolved in awareness. This is why Tolle so strongly emphasizes catching the small patterns, noticing the subtle shifts. If you wait until anger erupts, until you're in a full-blown rage, you've already missed the opportunity, the critical moment. The momentum, the intensity, is simply too strong. But if you catch the irritation at its very first stirring, at its inception, you can dissolve it gently before it builds into something uncontrollable, something destructive. The first and most foundational step is to become acutely aware, consciously aware, of what kind of thoughts you habitually think, especially those negative thoughts, the ones that seem to creep in unnoticed. Notice the irritation, notice the impatience, notice that subtle anger that cleverly masquerades as mild annoyance. This noticing, this simple act of observation, is the very beginning of true freedom. But here is where it becomes even more dangerous, even more challenging. The irritated ego doesn't want to be noticed. It has evolved sophisticated and almost devious ways of hiding, of disguising itself. It tells you, subtly, that your irritation is perfectly justified. It convinces you that the situation really is wrong, that the other person really is at fault, that your annoyance is simply a reasonable response to genuinely unreasonable circumstances. Complaining and reactivity are favorite mind patterns, preferred tools through which the ego strengthens itself. For many people, a large part of their mental and emotional activity consists of complaining and constantly reacting against this or that perceived injustice, this or that minor inconvenience. By doing this, by constantly pointing fingers, you make others, or a situation, definitively wrong, and yourself undeniably right. And through that feeling of superiority, that subtle sense of being morally superior, you strengthen, you validate your sense of self, your sense of ego. This is the core mechanism, the inner workings of the irritated ego. It turns every minor annoyance into evidence that you are the innocent victim of an imperfect world. It transforms small inconveniences into irrefutable proof that you deserve better. And with each complaint, each internal grumble, each moment of righteous irritation, the ego grows stronger, more entrenched. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, that strengthens the ego more than being right. And to be right, by definition, means that someone or something else has to be wrong. This perpetuates, this fuels a destructive cycle of conflict that extends far beyond the original, initial irritation. What started as a simple annoyance at slow traffic quickly becomes a general, pervasive attitude of life being somehow against you. The ego needs enemies, not necessarily dramatic, movie villain enemies, but those small, daily oppositions, those minor annoyances that constantly confirm its sense of separation, its us versus them mentality. Every irritation is a micro-enemy. Every annoyance is proof that you and the world are fundamentally at odds. The ego thrives on this constant, Low-level, emotional warfare. When you find yourself irritated, pause, just for a moment, and ask yourself, who is irritated? Not you. The awareness, not you. The consciousness, but the ego, that mental construct, that false self that needs opposition to feel real, to feel validated. This question alone, this simple act of self-inquiry, can begin to dissolve the irritation, because the moment you become aware of the ego, you are no longer completely, totally identified with it. The awareness that observes the irritation is not itself irritated. The consciousness that notices the ego is not the ego. Tolle points out that if there is any negativity involved, whether it's anger, resentment, or even subtle irritation, then the ego is definitely present there. This is a simple, but incredibly powerful, diagnostic tool. Any negativity equals ego. There are no exceptions to this rule when there is no negativity present, but there is an underlying field of peace. Then that feeling arises from a deeper place, or a more authentic place. That is not the ego. But the moment negativity appears, no matter how subtle, how fleeting, the ego has definitely entered the scene. This means, quite simply, that irritation is always an ego phenomenon. Always. You cannot be irritated and present at the same time. You cannot be annoyed and aware at the same time. The two states are mutually exclusive. They simply cannot coexist. Some people mistakenly believe that they can be spiritually aware while still feeling occasional, minor irritation. They think that the irritation is happening on one level, while their higher self observes from above, detached and unaffected. But this is a fundamental misunderstanding. If you are truly present, irritation simply does not arise. If irritation arises, presence has been lost. This is not a judgment. It's simply an observation. It's simply how consciousness operates. Presence and negativity cannot coexist. When one appears, the other disappears. The question is, which one will dominate your experience of life? There's a particular type of person who's especially susceptible to the frustrated ego. This is the person who prides themselves on never losing their cool. They never yell. They never lose their temper. They consider themselves calm, rational, composed. But underneath that seemingly serene exterior, annoyance is constantly churning. These people often believe they've transcended anger because they've suppressed its most obvious expressions. But suppression is not transcendence. The annoyance is still there, still feeding the ego, still keeping them trapped in everyday unawareness. It's simply learned to hide better. You can recognize this pattern by the tension in the body, the jaw that's slightly clenched, the shoulders that never fully relax, the subtle tightness around the eyes. The body does not lie. Even when the mind believes it's calm, the body reveals the truth of the inner state. If you find yourself saying that you're not an angry person, while simultaneously experiencing constant, low-level frustration, you've discovered an important truth about your ego. The annoyance you've been dismissing as insignificant is actually running your life. The frustrated ego has another dangerous quality. It's contagious. When you're in a state of subtle annoyance, you affect everyone around you. They may not consciously notice, but they feel it. Your energy field carries the vibration of resistance, of complaint, of not okayness, and this spreads. Think of a household where one person is constantly irritated, even if they never raise their voice and even if they never explicitly complain. The atmosphere becomes heavy. Other family members start feeling on edge without knowing why. The annoyance spreads like a subtle poison, and then others begin to react. They become irritated by your irritation. They start complaining about your complaining. The ego energy multiplies. What started as one person being slightly annoyed at something minor becomes a household where everyone is walking on eggshells. Everyone is slightly tense. Everyone is feeding their egos on the collective negativity. This is how everyday unawareness spreads through families, through workplaces, through entire communities. It does not require dramatic conflict. It only requires the persistent background radiation of irritation. Passed from one unconscious ego to another, Eckhart Tolle has observed that challenges can have one of two effects on a human being. A challenge can make someone more unconscious, more reactive, more deeply entrenched in egoic patterns, or a challenge can force someone to become more conscious, a consciousness expansion. Annoyance represents the first path. Each small challenge, as each minor inconvenience, becomes an opportunity to become slightly more unconscious. The ego uses annoyance to dig itself deeper into your psyche. Over time, the pattern becomes so ingrained that you cannot imagine life without it. But there is another way. Every moment of annoyance is also an opportunity for awakening, a spiritual awakening. The very thing that feeds the ego can become what dissolves it if you bring awareness to it. Eckhart Tolle has described working with people who transformed their relationship with irritation completely. One man came to him who had been irritated for most of his adult life. He was irritated at his job, irritated at his family, irritated at the state of the world. He did not see this as a problem. He saw it as a reasonable response to an irritating world. Eckhart Tolle simply asked him to observe his irritation without trying to change it, not to suppress it, not to express it, but simply to watch it. The man found this extremely difficult at first. The irritation was so woven into his experience that he could not separate himself from it enough to observe it, but gradually, with practice, he began to create a small gap between himself and the irritation. He began to notice the thoughts that triggered it, the physical sensations that accompanied it, the way it colored his entire perception of reality. And in that noticing, something shifted. The irritation did not disappear immediately. It continued to arise, but now there was awareness around it. There was space, and in that space, the irritation began to lose its power. It was no longer running his life. He was no longer the irritation. He was the awareness witnessing the irritation. This is the transformation that is available to everyone. It does not require special ability or years of practice. It only requires the willingness to observe your own mind with honesty. The key is to catch the irritation early, before it takes hold. The first foundational step is awareness of habitual thought patterns. When you notice the first stirring of annoyance, the first whisper of complaint, the first flicker of resistance, that is your opportunity. In the middle of experiencing irritation, awareness can arise. When the impulse comes to be annoyed, the awareness can be there. At that moment, you have a choice. You can take one conscious breath. You can simply be there as presence and let the irritation pass through you without feeding it. This is not suppression. You are not pushing the irritation down or pretending it's not there. You are simply observing it without adding to it. You are allowing it to be present without becoming it. When you do this, something remarkable happens. The irritation begins to lose its power. Without the fuel of identification, without the story of why you should be annoyed, the irritation has nothing to sustain it. It arises and passes, like a cloud moving across the sky. But if you engage with it, if you start thinking about why you have every right to be irritated, if you begin rehearsing complaints in your mind, you feed the beast. The irritation grows. It takes over more of your consciousness, and the ego becomes stronger. Ultimately, as you become more aware of reactive patterns, you can see them, whereas before, you were them. There is a huge difference between seeing a pattern inside yourself and being the pattern, or being used by it, merging with it, or acting it out totally. This is the journey from everyday unawareness to awareness, a consciousness expansion. It does not happen all at once. It happens moment by moment, irritation by irritation, reaction by reaction. Each time you catch yourself and choose presence over reactivity, you weaken the ego's hold. Conditioned patterns, including the pattern of annoyance, do not go away immediately as you become present. They have their momentum. They may act out for quite a while, even as presence is arising. This is why you should not expect perfection. You will still feel irritated sometimes. The pattern has been ingrained for years and perhaps decades. It will not vanish overnight, but each moment of awareness, it really matters. Each choice for presence over reactivity, it counts. As awareness grows, some people start to think they're actually getting worse because they can still see those dysfunctional patterns lurking inside themselves. But they're not getting worse. They're simply becoming more conscious of what's been there all along, for years. This is actually a sign of progress. The annoyance was always there, operating unconsciously. Now, you're seeing it, and seeing it is the beginning of freedom. The real danger is when you use this awareness as just another reason for annoyance, when you become irritated at yourself for being irritated. That's the ego trying to hijack your consciousness expansion for its own purposes. It can't stop you from becoming aware, so it tries to turn the awareness itself into a source of negativity. Be gentle with yourself. When you catch yourself getting annoyed, don't add another layer of judgment on top. Simply notice it. Simply breathe. Simply return to the present moment. The annoyance was there. Now it's seen. That's enough. There's a practice that Eckhart Tolle often suggests for working with frustration. When you notice frustration rising, instead of fixating on the cause, bring your attention to your body. Feel the physical sensation of the frustration. Where is it located? The chest, the stomach, the jaw? What does it actually feel like? By focusing on the physical dimension, you step out of the story that's fueling the frustration. The story says that someone did something wrong, that things should be different, that you have every right to be annoyed. But the body, it just has a sensation. When you feel the sensation directly without the story, you'll often find that it's surprisingly brief. It rises, it peaks, and it passes, usually in less than 90 seconds, if you don't feed it with thought. This is a powerful discovery. The frustration that seems to last all day only lasts all day because you keep revving it up with thought. You keep replaying the situation, rehearsing your complaints, imagining what you should have said. Each replay creates a new wave of physical sensation. But if you simply feel the sensation without the story, it moves through you quickly. The ego, it does not want you to know this. The ego thrives on the belief that frustration is caused by external circumstances, and that it'll last until those circumstances change. But frustration is actually internal, and it passes naturally when you stop feeding it. The ego loves to strengthen itself by complaining, whether in thoughts or in words, about other people, the situation you find yourself in, something that's happening right now, but shouldn't be, and even about yourself. When frustration arises, the thoughts have you, and if you want to be free, you have to understand that the voice in your head, it's created them, and the frustration you feel is just the emotional response then to that voice. The voice in your head is not you. The frustration is not you. They are patterns, habits, conditioned responses. You are the awareness that can observe them. You are the presence that existed before they arose and remains after they pass. This understanding is liberating. You don't have to fight the ego. You don't have to struggle against frustration. You simply have to see it for what it is: a pattern, a habit, a temporary cloud passing through the sky of your awareness. When you understand this deeply, frustration loses its grip. You still notice the pattern arising, but you no longer identify with it completely. There's space around it, there's awareness down surrounding it, and in that space, in that awareness, transformation happens, naturally. The frustrated ego is dangerous. Precisely because it seems so harmless, it flies under the radar of spiritual awareness. It disguises itself as a reasonable response to unreasonable situations. But now, you know its secret. Now, you can see through its disguise. Every moment of frustration is the ego feeding. Every complaint, every annoyance, every subtle frustration is fuel for everyday unawareness. But every moment of awareness is the ego dissolving. Every conscious breath, every return to presence, every choice not to engage with the story is a step toward freedom. You don't need to wait for a spiritual breakthrough. You don't need a mountaintop experience. The opportunity for consciousness expansion is present in every frustration you experience. Today, the traffic that annoys you, the co-worker who frustrates you, the small things that get under your skin, these are not obstacles to your awakening. They are the very material from which awakening is made. Use them. Every frustration is a bell calling you back to presence. Every annoyance is an invitation to awareness. The ego has been using these moments to strengthen itself. Now, you can use them to dissolve the ego. This is the paradox that Tolle points to. If you actually had an ideal life, it wouldn't contribute to your consciousness expansion. It's the very things that we don't want that provide the motivation for becoming more conscious. So don't wish for a life without frustrations. Don't imagine that consciousness expansion means never being annoyed. Instead, welcome the frustrations as teachers. Let them show you where the ego still has power. Let them reveal the patterns that still operate unconsciously. And then, moment by moment, breath by breath, bring awareness to these patterns. Watch them arise. Feel them in your body. Notice how the mind creates stories to justify them. And then, without judgment, let them go. This is the work. It's not glamorous. It's not dramatic. It happens in traffic jams and grocery store lines, in conversations with difficult people, and alone with your own thoughts. But it's the work that actually transforms consciousness. Consider what your life would look like if frustration no longer controlled you, not because circumstances improved, but because your relationship to circumstances transformed. The traffic would still be slow. Sometimes, people would still do things that once annoyed you. Life would still present challenges, but you would no longer be at the mercy of these things. You would meet them with presence. Instead of resistance, you would respond. Instead of react, you would remain connected to the peace. That is your true nature, regardless of what is happening around you. This is not a fantasy. This is the natural state of someone who has dissolved the pattern of frustration. It's what Tolle has been pointing toward throughout his teaching. Not a special achievement, but a return to what you were before the ego convinced you that frustration was necessary. The ego tells you that frustration protects you, that without it, people would take advantage of you, that annoyance is how you maintain standards in a world that falls short. But this is a lie. Frustration does not protect you. It imprisons you. It keeps you trapped in a state of constant, low-level suffering, while simultaneously convincing you that the suffering is entirely justified. True discernment, real clarity, does not require annoyance. You can absolutely recognize when something is misaligned without getting frustrated by it. You can make changes, necessary changes, without being in resistance. You can maintain healthy boundaries without the negativity that poisons your own peace. The irritated ego is far more dangerous than you've ever imagined. But now that you see it, it's also more vulnerable than you've ever imagined. Awareness is the light in which no darkness can survive. Bring that light to every single irritation and watch the ego gradually dissolve. The witnessing presence deep inside you is the only thing from which the ego can truly be recognized. That presence is always available. That awareness is always here. It's not something you need to create or achieve. It is simply what you are when you stop identifying with those irritating thoughts and emotions. You are not your irritation. You are not your complaints. You are not your ego. You are the awareness in which all of these appear and disappear. And when you rest in that awareness, when you're simply present without the story of what should be different, you discover a peace that irritation can never touch. This is what Eckhart Tolle so wisely points toward: not a life without challenges, not an existence free of annoyances, but a way of being in which those challenges and those annoyances no longer disturb the fundamental peace of your true nature. The journey begins now. It begins with this moment. It begins with whatever irritation you are currently experiencing or will experience next. Will you feed the ego, or will you choose awareness? Will you add to the everyday unawareness of the world, or will you contribute to its spiritual awakening, to its consciousness expansion? The choice is made moment by moment, and each choice truly matters. The awareness that understands this and is already beginning to awaken. What you do with the next moment of irritation will determine the direction of your consciousness. Sources: Eckhart Tolle, official site, Balancing Negative Emotions article. Can the ego become stronger as one grows more conscious article. Oprah interviews, Wisdom, B excerpts.